Okay, I am welcoming Steve Webb, Superintendent of Vancouver Public Schools. Hey, Steve, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Kim. How are you?
Good. Good to see you.
It's good to be seen.
Okay, no, ditto. Why don't we get started by telling folks a little bit about Vancouver Public Schools?
You bet. America's Vancouver Public Schools is in Southwest Washington. It's on the north bank of the Columbia River, just north of Portland, Oregon. We serve nearly 24,000 students in 37 schools. It's a rapidly urbanizing school system. We currently serve 45% of our students are students of color. 25% of our students come from homes where a language other than English is spoken. We have nearly 100 different languages spoken in Vancouver Public Schools. To date, about 51% of our students qualify for free and reduced price meals, one indicator of poverty. That's up from 39% a decade ago. It peaked during the Great Recession at about 57%. Some of our downtown schools in our urban core have in excess of 90% of the students qualifying for free and reduced price meals, 40% mobility rate, 25% of the students are second language learners. Very urban in context in terms of the complexity and challenges of serving students and families. I'm in my 13th year as superintendent here in Vancouver Public Schools, and Kim, as you know, Vancouver Public Schools was one of the founding members of Digital Promises League of Innovative Schools.
Absolutely, and glad to have Vancouver kind of taking the lead as a league district early on. I think, Steve, you know, that's part of the reason why your district has been able to put in place a strategy where I've heard you mention almost 100% of your students have internet access and devices. Can you talk a little bit about what has been your strategy to enable access and support for students around technology?
I like to describe our digital transformation as a more mature systems approach. We launched our digital transformation work in 2008. We had hundreds of stakeholders involved in a set of community conversations around the future of Vancouver Public Schools. One of the strategic goal areas that surfaced as a result of those community-based conversations was this notion of 21st century flexible learning environments. And that is the goal area that really drives this notion of future-ready graduates, future-ready learning environments. And so we've been at this for some time. In 2013, we put in front of our community a technology levy funding measure that would resource to scale this digital transformation. And of course, it wasn't just about access to mobile learning devices, learning management systems, digital content. We also invested significantly in our capacity building relative to transforming teaching and learning experiences for students as a way of really leveraging the technology to accelerate student achievement and close achievement and opportunity gaps. In that first set of investments in 2013, about a third of all of the resources that we were spending on scaling our digital transformation was really about professional development and training and job embedded coaching, because that's what we know works. Subsequently, in 2019, we put in front of our voters a refresh of that technology levy. and 71% of our voters in our community supported that revenue request, which has enabled us to think more tactically and strategically as a whole community about this notion of broadband connectivity. You know, in remote learning and distance learning, without reliable internet broadband connectivity, by design, you have created an inequitable learning system. A number of years ago, we resourced hotspots through grant funding. And then as we refreshed our technology levy built-in capacity to ensure that broadband connectivity was not an issue for any family in Vancouver Public Schools. So 100% of our students have access to a mobile learning device and all of the digital assets relative to supporting remote learning 2.0. 100% of our students have access to broadband connectivity. And when necessary, we will provide multiple hotspots in order to ensure that families with multiple children don't create inequities within their household relative to who gets on and when, right? So we've been really strategic in thinking about this to scale.
So you're about 11 years into your plan, right? You mentioned you started in 2008, 2009, 11, 12 years in. Talk a little bit about how your infrastructure weathered the storm, so to speak, of spring, right, 20, and then how you put systems in place to go into this new school year. Can you give us a sense of those pieces?
I think as school districts across the country pivoted immediately in 2013 to remote learning 2.0, what was elevated or amplified was all of the underlying inequities that existed systemically, not just in terms of access and opportunities, but really the amplification of equitable learning experiences from classroom to classroom and school to school. You know, every system was doing the very best they could in a moment of crisis. Last March and April, as the pandemic hit and school districts needed to pivot and flip quickly to sustain some kind of remote learning experiences for children. What we learned over the course of this last spring, given stakeholder feedback from families and from staff, is that we needed to really simplify the proliferation of access points for families and students, frankly, to navigate. You know, when you scale over time, you have a tendency to magnify the amount of digital content, the amount of digital apps, the amount of digital assets that are brought to bear to support student learning along the way. And of course, we needed to create some coherence as a system. That's what we heard from families. Like, we need a single sign-on, right?
Yeah.
We need one coherent learning management system. And of course, we've been an Instructure Canvas user for some time, but at the elementary level, we were using Seesaw as our learning management system. And of course, Seesaw provides lots of really wonderful solutions and tools, but it really wasn't a sort of platform where parents could interface with staff. And so really, part of our responsibility is to create coherence and to simplify so that we can support parents as they're working side by side with their children in this remote learning experience. We also heard very clearly from families that we needed improved accountability for students to engage and participate, accountability in terms of the demonstrations of learning relative to the experiences over this past spring, and frankly, accountability for our faculty and staff, both in terms of just, synchronous and asynchronous supports, but really creating a more uniform, coherent, and accountable experience for everyone, so that we really elevated a set of expectations for students and staff. And then the last thing that we are really focused on, and we've got significant work to do, is really creating more equitable learning experiences for students from classroom to classroom and school to school. And of course, we've got professional staff all along the continuum that we're supporting to the very best of our ability as we transition to this remote learning 2.0. We have families all along the continuum relative to their own skill sets that they bring. And we have staff and families all along the continuum relative to their own challenges as employees, as parents, trying to navigate really unprecedented times with this pandemic. So we got to create grace and space, but yet at the same time, we have to amplify and elevate a set of expectations relative to communication, coherence, accountability, and engagement for all kids and parents.
Wow, absolutely. I love the idea of this coherence piece because you had some time to think that through and really put that in place for the fall, which is great. One aspect of the work that you do that I love that is very equity centered are your community resource centers. And I'm curious about how you have engaged that network in supporting students and families and supporting equity through this time period with COVID-19. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. As you know, we've scaled our community schools work from 2 to 20 school sites. Our community schools work really is about the village, schools, families, and community really interacting as partners to leverage assets, community-based assets that reduce barriers to student learning. Everything from food pantries to childcare to employment opportunities to basic needs, clothing, all of the kinds of supports that are often challenges for communities and families addressing issues of poverty. So as we pivoted this last spring with remote learning, we really leveraged our family community resource centers as part of our food distribution network, as part of our digital technology and learning support distribution network, because these are places in our schools where people are already accustomed to coming for support. Of course, all of this was done in socially distanced, PPE, appropriate health and safety precaution with appropriate health and safety precautions. And as the need continued to grow, particularly around food, we saw that some of our county partners were then beginning to shift to larger distribution sites. And that then subsequently reduced the amount of fresh produce, for example, that we were receiving at these distribution centers. But it is it is a central network of supports that continue to scaffold and provide assets at a time when many of our families who were already on the margin are being stressed to the point where they don't know where to turn absent these family community resource centers.
Yes, yes, absolutely. As we wrap up here, I would love to hear, as a superintendent, and how you've been navigating equity in your district. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you have put in place in terms of community partners or partners that you work with in Vancouver, and just any insight or advice you would give as superintendents are thinking about partnerships that can support either access devices or community support. So I wanted to see if there's any partnerships you want to highlight and any advice you want to give there.
Yeah, many districts across the nation are scaling more deliberately focused equity initiatives, including Vancouver Public Schools. We've been equity focused for some time. We've made great progress relative to closing achievement and opportunity gaps for children in our school system, but we have work that we still need to do. And in light of all that has transpired over the last 6 months, we want to amplify diversity and equity and inclusion work and build a set of partnerships with stakeholders that can cultivate outcomes and sustain outcomes into the future. We're convening an equity advisory group of stakeholders, and that equity advisory group is very diverse, representing communities of color, communities of life experience, in an effort to help us take stock of where we are as a system. We're preparing to issue an equity RFP, and we intend to contract with a firm to do a third-party equity audit with business practices throughout the system, everything relative to hiring and placement, to curriculum, to community partnerships, to board policy and procedure, finance and budget distribution, all of the kinds of things that we know that if we don't examine where we're at relative to systemic and institutional biases, we're not going to get to the place that we need relative to outcomes for all kids, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual preference. We need to attend to this if we're going to cultivate and sustain an anti-racist approach to educating our children in this country. And so we're committed to examining our system, and this equity advisory group will help inform a set of go-forward plans as a result of that equity audit that will likely call into question business practices, a set of underlying either values or beliefs or implicit biases that come into play relative to the way in which this system has operated. But you've got to have the courage to lead in an equity-focused way. And regardless of the work that we have done here over the past decade, and we're proud of our progress, we've got more work to do. And this will help us get to a place where we can create more equitable outcomes for all kids.
Absolutely. I appreciate you ending on that note because, as you and I know, equity is the #1 focus across the League of Innovative Schools. And being able to get underneath the surface and be really honest about that is really important. And appreciate your leadership in stepping forward with that. Looking forward to hearing how that work goes. And just thank you so much, Steve, for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's good to see you, Kim. Thank you.
All right. Take care.